Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here to answer a question that sometimes people fling at me. As you know, I am not always a fan of Roger Norrington. I think he's possibly the worst musician from the second half of the 20th century, if only because of the fraudulent attempt to impose his personal timbral preferences on romantic repertoire, those preferences being based on badly conceived, horribly interpreted. Well, let me just put it this way. He's wrong. He's wrong about almost everything he says when it comes to the way this music sounded and was performed. And we have the recorded evidence of it from the conductors who actually were alive at the time. And we've had this discussion, right? We know that the guy's basically winging it and faking it. And yet he did a Beethoven cycle in Stuttgart, to which I awarded a 10-10. And everybody points to me and says, "Oh, but you gave that a 10-10. What's wrong with you?" Like I'm not being consistent. Well, there are many reasons why I gave it a 10-10, and I stand by that rating. I think it is an extraordinary representation of his approach. And I am completely out of sympathy with that approach. But that my opinion in that sense doesn't really matter. Because what matters is that I understand what he was trying to do. And in this series of recordings, he accomplished it. And first of all, I wanted to give credit to the orchestra, which understood, if Norrington didn't, that they were doing a complete Beethoven cycle and that it mattered. And they were determined, it seemed to me, on listening, to do their really very, very best for him and for the composer based on the parameters that he insisted that they adhere to. So from that point of view, it was really, I think, an exceptional effort. It also sounded marvelous. It was very, very well recorded. It was on Hensler, and maybe it's SWR now. I don't know. So it really was fine. And it was markedly superior to his first Beethoven cycle with the London Classical Players, which was horrible. Oh, horrible in so many ways. One of the things that makes his interpretations so appalling of this music is his insistence that the strings play with no vibrato. And not only was that not true, the strings played with no vibrato back then, but it was impossible, actually, because conductors didn't exist and everyone wasn't doing the same thing, and there was no uniformity of standards and all those things. But more to the point, when does non-vibrato playing sound awful? Here is the gigantic hypocrisy that underlies the whole approach that Norrington and his period instrument colleagues generally take when it comes to vibrato. The bottom line is, every single treatise that we ever heard of in the history of humanity that talks about vibrato, even the ones that say it's an embellishment that should be used infrequently, they all say when you use it on sustained notes and slow tempos, at the ends of phrases. There are all these places where it's appropriate. And most of the time, you will find those places in the slow movements of symphonies. And the reason is very simple. Vibrato is a function of tempo. People don't talk about this very much, but you're wiggling your finger, and in order for the vibrato, whether it's an ornamental, crazy vibrato or just a subtle little whisper of emotional expression, whatever it is, it takes time to apply. It takes time to do. It takes time for you to hear it. It takes time for it to make its effect of warming up the timbre. And in quick tempos, whether you're using vibrato or not, it doesn't make any difference. You won't hear it for the most part. And this is a fascinating thing. It's more likely that you'll hear it in solo playing than in orchestral playing, obviously, because you're only dealing with one violinist instead of a corporate average of what dozens of people are doing, where it's inaudible anyway. It's only becomes a sectional timbre. But the bottom line is that when you have people playing zippily, the whole idea of continuous vibrato goes out the window. I mean, these these period instrument people talk about modern continuous vibrato. I mean, Norrington always called it constant vibrato. It's nonsense. In allegro movements, most notes don't have any vibrato at all because you're you're doing this on the fingerboard, right? I mean, you're just sitting there going like this, and your fingers are going all over the place, and the bow's going like this. And when are you going to make vibrato? You can't. 80% of the notes that violinists play don't have it. As a matter of course, it's an impossibility. So modern continuous vibrato can only refer to those places where it might be applied. And those places where it might be applied, and where every treatise that ever discussed the topic says it should be applied, are precisely the places where Norrington and his cronies do not apply it, because that's the only place you can hear its absence. And that whole discussion is brushed under the rug. It's beyond ridiculous. So how does he get away with it? How does he get away with this? His hideous string timbre in these Beethoven symphonies. Well, they're just unbelievably fast. I mean, they're unbelievably fast in the slow movements. They're faster than the metronome marking in the slow movements. One of the reasons, a lot of people have asked, why is it that the period instrument movement often plays things so quickly? They take everything lickety-split. Well, one of the reasons is because the string tone would be absolutely intolerable if they played it at a normal tempo, because they would have time to do the vibrato, and you would hear that it's not there, and the result would sound totally inexpressive. Whereas if they speed everything up, then they can get away with it, because you're not listening to the expressive qualities of individual tones for any length of time. That's just a fact, folks. And I know, it's going to sound offensive for me to say so, because I see in the comments, Hurwitz is still fighting the battles of the 80s that were long ago lost. Well, no, they weren't lost. The discussion of whether or not playing is appropriate, whether or not the sound is appropriate, whether or not the performance is expressive, those are not top topics about whether there are, in which there are winners and losers. Those are ongoing discussions. So if it sounds like I'm fighting old battles, fine. They need to be fought, because the people who allegedly won, I don't even know what that means, are wrong. We need to keep telling them until they are right. So Norrington's Beethoven is wrong in many ways. It is wrong in all kinds of ways. But the speed with which he takes these slow movements, rendering them utterly cold for the most part, still tells us that he has understood how to maximize whatever positive qualities there are in his approach. That's what he does in this cycle. It is an extreme case of the Norrington doctrine, the Stuttgart sound that he created, applied to the Beethoven symphonies in the most artful way. And for that reason, I gave the thing a 10-10. It deserved it. Did I like it? Not really. Have I listened to it much since? No. Do I plan on listening to it anytime soon? No. It's pretty wretched, actually, as my view of what Beethoven ought to sound like. But as Norrington's view of what Beethoven ought to sound like, it is superb. And there you have it, friends. I was attempting, maybe foolishly, to take a step back and listen in a more objective way, and allow people who might not share my view of what Beethoven should sound like, a view of what an excellent version of that type of interpretation is. So there you have it. That's the reason. That's my longest apologia that I'm going to give on that topic, but I think it's an interesting one. I really do. I really think that this whole discussion of performance practice, it just blows my mind. It really blows my mind when I hear from these people that my protests are dated. As if anything like that can be dated. Like as if music has, like the period instrument movement won. It didn't win anything. It just does things in certain ways, and some of those ways have been very, very good and very helpful and salutary, and have perked up our ears and introduced us to tons of new repertoire, and they've been marvelous. And some of them have been absolutely horrible. horrible when they try to tell us that music which has been in the repertoire for like decades or centuries even, and which we know from direct provenance of the people who knew the composers and who knew how they wanted it played and who were part of great traditions of performance, telling us that that's all wrong because some Baroque treatise said it's wrong for music written 200 years later or 100 years later. I mean, come on. They're just being silly. And the silliest of all was Roger Norrington, without a doubt. Without a doubt. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me, and take care.